fingerprint, whether that fingerprint was left there on that surface in December of 2008, or whether it was left there on May 5th of 2009, you wouldn't be able to determine that.
Unless there were some other factors that influenced the fingerprint, no.
I meant just on the blatant print alone.
No.
And based upon your training experience, you don't have any reason to believe that it's likely that anyone else would be able to make that determination.
That's correct.
With regards to DNA evidence, is it your understanding, based upon your training and knowledge and experience, that DNA evidence can continue to exist on a surface for an extended period of time? Or is there a limited period of time when DNA evidence exists?
No, it would be the same thing again based on, other factors that would affect the evidence itself.
And that's things like temperature and
weather,
heat and
exactly.
moisture and weather and all of those kinds of things.
That's correct.
But isn't it possible, based upon your training and knowledge and experience, that DNA evidence can exist for a long period of time,
yes.
Certainly longer than 6 months?
Yes.
And when we're talking about DNA evidence existing on a surface, that DNA evidence is transferred through body fluids, is that correct?
That could be one way, yes.
It's also possible that it's transferred through essentially skin cells.
Correct.
Any part of my body that touches or comes in contact with another surface, and that can be another body, can't it?
Correct.
If parts of my body fluids, my skin, my hair, some portion of me that contains genetic information with regards to me, comes in contact with some other surface or some other body, my DNA evidence can be transferred.
Can be, yes.
It doesn't happen every time.
That's correct.
And the process of you going through and trying to identify certain evidence at the scene to determine whether or not DNA evidence is present, you realize that it could be on a surface for an extended period of time.
Correct.
So no reason that you would have to believe, is there, that if DNA evidence was found on a particular item, that you would be able to identify when it was placed on that item?
That's correct.
That's true, that it can extend over time periods.
Correct.
And certainly that time period would include from December of 2008 to May 5th of 2009.
Yes.
So if DNA was found at some scene, it could have been put there 6 months ago.
Correct.
In terms of the transferring or moving around of DNA evidence, do you think it's fair to presume that babies, due to their nature of spitting and wetting their diapers and drooling and having their faces wiped, that they're more likely to spread DNA evidence than adults are?
Not having any children, I cannot accurately answer that.
So you don't know?
I do not know.
But all of those things that I mentioned, urine or feces or drool or runny noses, all would potentially contain DNA evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And based upon training, knowledge, and experience, if a baby's face was wiped with a diaper or a cloth or a T-shirt or any other item, it would be possible to transfer DNA evidence material from one to the other.
That's correct.
And is it your experience and knowledge and training that DNA evidence can potentially be found on different types of surfaces and objects?
Yes.
Also, your understanding that DNA evidence, in terms of being found, you can find it in a couple of different ways. You can swab it, as you talked about.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Where you take a potential surface and you rub, as you say, a swab on it, and hoping to pick up material, and that's by using a wet swab generally, right?
Yes.
And then you're hoping that what's been transferred to that surface is then transferred to that swab, and then when that swab is given to an analyst for the purposes of attempting to evaluate it, that what was on that surface that was swabbed or rubbed would then be on the swab itself for the purpose of analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so that's one of the ways that you collect DNA evidence from the scene.
Yes.
The other way is you can collect the object itself, clothing items as an example. Is that right?
That's right.
If it's suspected that blood is on an item, or spit, or drool, or anything else that contained a body fluid is on a clothing item, one means would be to collect that actual clothing item, and then the clothing item itself can be tested chemically or electronically to determine the presence of DNA.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
In this particular instance, you took a section of carpeting out of the house that had potential blood staining on it. Is that correct?
That's right.
And the reason you took that out of the house was because you were going to test the actual item itself, the carpeting itself, or the marks on the carpeting, to see if it contained DNA evidence.
That's correct.
One of the other things that you're testing is for the presence of blood. And you're looking at an item that looks like it's potentially blood, and that's because it's red or brownish in color. Is that essentially how you're deciding what's potentially blood at a scene?
That's one of the ways, yes.
It's a common sense element. It's the primary way that you look at something and say, this might be blood, because it looks like blood.
Correct.
There's a chemical test that can be done on that blood at the scene, or on that potential blood at the scene, and that's generally done by swabbing also.
Correct.
And in this instance, you took several samples of what was potentially blood evidence at the scene. Is that correct?
That's right.
But whether it is or whether it isn't blood is something that you can't tell in any way by looking at it, can you?
No.
In this particular instance, did you analyze any of the items yourself at the scene? Meaning, did you conduct any chemical testing on any of the items taken from the scene or any of the areas that you ultimately swabbed at the scene?
Only the wall at D, I believe it was, where the amido black was done in order to look for the fingerprints. Amido black is also considered a presumptive test for blood.
Okay. And when you did that presumptive test, did it indicate the presence of blood?
It indicated the presence of proteins, which could indicate the substance may be blood.
So it may have been blood, and it may have been something else.
That's correct.
That was protein-based.
Correct.
That's all essentially that presumptive test is doing, is trying to identify that.
That's correct.
And whether there were or were not other particular testings that were done on that blood is something that I have to look and ask somebody else.
That's correct.
You can say, I saw it, I packaged it, I tested it, I put it inside of an envelope. You can presume it got sent to FDLE or someplace else, and FDLE is the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, right?
Yes.
It could have been sent to there or to the FBI for testing. And the ultimate results of that testing is not something you're doing at the scene. You're essentially gathering up the information that can be used by somebody else.
That's correct.
When we're talking about potential blood at a scene, much like the question I asked you about DNA and the question that I asked you about fingerprint, potential blood at a scene, obviously subject to washing and weather and moisture, may remain at a scene and may at one point be gone from the scene, but that time period that potential blood can remain at a scene can be an extended period of time also, can't it?
Again, depending on where it is, the weather, the other elements that involve the scene.
And once again, the potential of blood existing is something that at least for the time period from December of 2008 until May 5th of 2009 is a time period in which, based upon your training, knowledge, and experience, it would be possible for potential blood to remain on a surface.
It depends, again, on the surface about whether or not it would last for
I well know that. If somebody comes along and scrubs hard, it might be gone quicker, although even if they scrub hard, the truth is it still might be there. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
Many crime scenes you go to, you'd look around and you wouldn't see any obvious blood there, but there are chemical testings that you can do that even if it's washed away, if people have scrubbed it away, tried to make it go away, you can still sometimes find potential blood there. Isn't that true?
That's correct.
And that's over a long period of time, and even with efforts made to make the blood go away.
That's correct.
So blood evidence, we know, like fingerprints and like DNA evidence, might last for a long period of time.
Yes.
I presume you have training, knowledge, and experience that would tell you that that long period of time is really a very long period of time, isn't it? It's years, potentially.
It could be, yes, sir.
We probably don't even know the outside limits to that, but years is not beyond reason, is it?
No, sir.
With regards to DNA, with regards to fingerprints, and with regards to blood, all three, is that correct?
That's correct.
So the age of evidence at the scene is something that you don't know.
No.
And you probably, based on your training, knowledge, experience, presume that nobody else can figure out actual age.
Again, it depends on the scene and the type of evidence. Say, for example, an apartment with a bloodstain on a wall, one would assume that it wasn't there from the previous tenants and then new tenants allowed to move in, that it would have been repaired. But that's for just an example of a limit. But it depends on the individual scene. It depends on the evidence. It depends on the bodily, material you're looking for.
Part of what you do at the crime scene, though, is to attempt to identify those items either brought to the scene or taken from the scene that might have some sort of evidence on it that can be used for the purposes of identification.
Correct.
And identification for your purposes really falls into two big groups. I know there's some subgroups. Fingerprints that can be matched back to a known individual, and in addition to that, DNA evidence that can be matched back to a known individual. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that, truthfully, the two biggest groups of how identifications are made at the scene?
Yes.
I know that there's subsets of that, and there can be fiber analysis. That's one thing, right?
Yes.
There can be hair analysis separate apart from DNA, actually examining the actual hair follicles themselves. Isn't that right?
Right.
And there are some other minor areas, but in today's world, in the scientific world that we live in, fingerprint evidence and DNA evidence are the two primary things that are being compared. Is that correct?
Those are the big ones, yes.
In this particular instance, were there items that were left behind? And I presume the answer is obviously yes, because it looked like there was lots of items in that house. Isn't that true?
Yes.
Were there items that were left behind that could have been evaluated or analyzed for the purposes of determining the presence of DNA?
Yes.
Isn't it true that for clothing items, once a person has worn the clothing, or sometimes even if they've just touched the clothing, but certainly if they've worn clothing, isn't there a high likelihood that DNA evidence will be found on that clothing?
I can't define likelihood as being high or low. I simply don't have the information as far as the numbers. It's possible, yes.
In this particular crime scene, did you observe at least what appeared to you to be women's clothing, men's clothing, and babies' clothing, or just some parts of that?
No, all three.
You found women's clothing, men's clothing, and baby clothing present.
Yes.
And also present at the scene was what appeared to be a men's jacket on the back of a chair. Is that right?
I don't recall that jacket.
You don't recall the jacket being present. You recall other clothing items being present, however, that weren't collected, like the items you had in the brown bag that one of the detectives said, collect these up.
Yes.
Some of those items were left behind.
Yes.
And you would presume that nobody, therefore, analyzed those items.
That's correct.
I know you don't know what happened the day after you were gone, but I presume you've been involved in this investigation. Do you have any reason to believe other items were taken from that house on other days for the purposes of processing?
I don't know that information at all.
Be beyond your knowledge.
It would.
Potential blood evidence that you saw on the wall, do you know if there were results obtained with regards to analysis performed on that potential blood evidence?
I do not know that.
So if there was or there wasn't is just outside of your knowledge.
Correct.
We went through a series of photographs that we saw on the Elmo. Are those all of the photographs you took at the scene that day?
No.
There were other photographs.
Yes.
And I know we've seen a general overview of various photographs taken at the scene, but if what we saw this morning, was that the majority of photos taken from the scene, or a minority of photos taken at the scene, or do you just not know based upon your observations?
According to my report, if I can reference that, I took 119 photographs. So, clearly we didn't see 119 photos.
I believe we saw a total of 60 photographs here this morning.
So half.
So about half. So there were other photographs taken that were generally also taken of the scene.
Yes.
And that would have been photos taken both inside the scene and photos taken outside of the scene?
Yes.
And that might have depicted certain specific items at the scene other than the items that you talked about here today?
Correct.
Were you aware of there being an allegation of a soda, meaning a soft drink, having been poured on the victim, Emmanuel Murray, during the course of the commission of this offense?
No.
Were you aware of the presence of any soda cans, as you sit here today, being present at the scene of the offense?
No.
We're talking about an aluminum soda can. Would it be possible is all I'm asking you, I understand you're not going to be able to testify to percentages, would it be potentially possible to receive fingerprint evidence off of a soda can, off of an aluminum can?
Yes.
In the course of your training and experience, is that a surface off of which you've obtained latent fingerprints before?
Yes.
When I say latent fingerprints, I'm talking about the fingerprints you can't really see because it's the processing that makes invisible fingerprints actually become visible, isn't it?
Yes, that's true.
You're putting dust on it or a chemical solution and it makes the fingerprint images show up on an item.
Correct.
But it's an aluminum can that a soft drink or soda would be in. Is that a surface that you would expect to possibly be able to receive fingerprint evidence from?
Yes.
And in this instance, did you process any soda can at the scene for potential fingerprint evidence?
No, I had no knowledge when I was on scene that a soda can was involved in this.
The item that was used was a plastic pitcher that contained water, separate and apart from soda. Would it be possible, based on your training, knowledge, and experience, to obtain fingerprints off of a water pitcher, a plastic water pitcher?
It completely depends on the surface, whether or not it could be like, say, a brushed plastic with a rough surface, or it could be a smoother surface. It really depends on the actual item, again, and also on the individual leaving the fingerprints.
And that's right. Whether there was sometimes how much they were sweating or not sweating, that would be a factor, wouldn't it?
That could be, yes.
And on the surface itself, if it was a water pitcher, whether it was cold or hot, and wet on the outside, or had condensation or not, all those are variables, right?
Yes.
But in terms of possibilities, if you were processing a scene and you were trying to identify a suspect, and you knew that suspect had touched a plastic water pitcher, is that a surface that you would normally think would possibly contain latent fingerprints?
It's a surface that I would collect and attempt to get fingerprints off of. Without seeing the item, I can't make any judgment about whether or not I would get
I
fingerprints off.
understand that. And one of the suggestions you made is that if it's a rough surface, it's harder to get fingerprints off of a rough surface than a smooth surface.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And part of the process that you may go to is to collect it, to let it not have condensation on it, and I would presume you would be more likely to test a surface like that when it wasn't damp or when it wasn't wet after it had dried. Is that correct?
That would be correct.
If the soda was contained in a standard plastic soft drink bottle, the kind that we provide that has the twist-off cap on the top of it, same questions as I was asking you with regards to a can, based upon your training, knowledge, and experience, is the outside of a plastic soft drink container the kind of surface from which you would anticipate it to be possible to obtain fingerprints?
Yes.
In this particular instance, processing this crime scene, did Detective Pettis or Detective Morgan bring to your attention, or did you notice on your own, in your collaborative efforts of processing the scene, a potential soda bottle at the scene that you were asked to process for one reason or another?
A Gatorade bottle, yes, sir.
A Gatorade bottle?
Yes.
And did you process that Gatorade bottle at the scene, or did you process that Gatorade bottle away from the scene?
Actually, I just collected the Gatorade bottle. I did not process it.
So you didn't process it for fingerprints?
That's correct.
And as you sit here today, do you know if that Gatorade bottle was ever processed by someone else?
I don't know that.
When you're the crime scene technician who's at the scene and going through the process of photographing and collecting and processing evidence, would it be normal practice once an item had been collected for you to process it for the possible presence of fingerprints, or would that normally be somebody else's responsibility?
It can be a shared responsibility within the unit. It really depends on, say, for example, if I'm off on a particular day and they want the item processed that day, someone else may check it out. Or if it's something that can wait, they may say, let Terry do it when she gets back to work. So it really depends on what's going on.
And in this particular instance, do you know what decision was made with regards to that Gatorade bottle that you know you collected?
I do not know that.
As you sit here right now today, do you know whether or not that Gatorade bottle was ever processed for the presence of latent fingerprints?
I don't know.
With regards to that Gatorade bottle that you know was collected from the scene, did you swab it looking for the potential presence of DNA evidence?
No.
And do you have any knowledge as to whether or not anybody else ever processed it for the presence of any DNA evidence?
I don't know.
And you said that there was no can. If there was a can at the scene containing soda, you don't recall seeing any can, and so therefore I presume it's fair for me to presume you never processed any soda can at the scene for the potential presence of DNA evidence.
No, I didn't know that any soda can was involved in the instance. If I had known that and had seen a soda can, then I would have probably made note of it or collected it. But I didn't have any knowledge that a soda can was involved in this scene.
Thank you. Were you assisted at the scene by someone else?
Yes.
Who was that?
One of my supervisors.
And who was that?
His name is Corporal Art Picard.
And Art Picard, did he participate in the actual collection of any of the items at the scene?
No.
What was his purpose in being there?
He assisted me when I needed to take measurements of the different rooms and the different items of evidence.
So he held the other end of the tape measure.
Correct.
And did he actually take any photographs at the scene that you're aware of?
No.
And did Corporal Picard actually collect any evidence at the scene that you're aware of?
No.
Would that have been his responsibility or would that have been yours?
If he collected anything, it would have been his responsibility.
Have you had a chance to look to see if any items were collected by Corporal Picard?
I have not.
So you don't know one way or the other?
To the best of my knowledge, on that scene, he did not collect any items from that location.
Other than helping you taking measurements, what was his other participation at the scene?
Generally, we'll have a supervisor on a scene, larger scenes or homicide scenes, in order to help facilitate questions between myself, between the detectives, between other people of rank.
How long were you at the scene?
I'd have to check my report, but I believe it was just a few hours.
And during the time that you were at the scene, for the few hours, were you receiving updates with regards to information?
I don't recall.
Are there any particular facts that you recall as you sit here today that you received either from Detective Pettis or Detective Morgan or from some third source that would have supplemented information you had about the circumstances of the offense?
There's no information that I recall getting.
Let's talk about signs of forced entry. I understood your testimony to be that you checked for signs of forced entry, but you didn't find any signs of forced entry.
That's correct.
And tell me the kinds of things specifically you would be looking for when we're talking about forced entry.
Again, what I'm looking for is pry marks on a window to show like maybe where a tool had been inserted to pry a window up, to break a lock. A broken window or a broken door jamb, for example, is a good sign of possible forced entry. Maybe, if there's a boot print on a door, that might be something that you would say, okay, this is a possible sign of forced entry.
And at this residence that you examined that morning, in terms of possible locations of forced entry, that essentially would have been one door and 3 windows.
That's correct.
One of those windows being a window essentially to the living room area that was on the north side of the residence.
Yes.
And 2 windows on the south side of the residence, one of those going into a bedroom area and a smaller window that would have led into the kitchen, essentially over the kitchen sink.
Yes.
And also a front door that essentially was located between the 2 windows on the south side, as depicted in the crime scene diagram that you had.
Yes.
Did you check at each of the windows to determine whether or not there were signs of forced entry at all 3 windows?
Yes.
And did you find any?
I did not.
And did you find that the locks on the windows were in a locked position at all 3 windows?
Yes.
And in addition to that, I believe it was your testimony with regards to your examination of the one photograph that was taken of the scene with regards to a yellow stick, essentially, that was in the rear window that you perceived to be there as an additional locking mechanism. Is that correct?
Correct.
And at the front door, you didn't find any signs of forced entry?
No.
Did you find any signs at the front door of the residence that would have indicated to you possibly previous forced entry?
I don't recall.
And that's something you sometimes find at a scene, isn't it?
Yes.
That you find pry marks that look like, maybe they're pry marks, but they don't look fresh.
That's possible, right.
That would be from weathering or rust or various other things, correct?
Correct.
Did you find any of those kinds of signs in the examination of this crime scene?
I don't recall.
With regards to the entryway where the door was found, did you have the opportunity to examine the doorknob and or locking mechanism that was on the door?
Other than just looking at it, but as far as manipulating it, no, I did not.
Did you test it to see if the door locked?
No.
So, as you sit here today, whether the lock could be locked or whether it wasn't locked, you don't know.
Don't know.
Do you recall, as you sit here today, whether there was a separate doorknob and a separate deadbolt, or was it all one locking mechanism? Do you recall?
I don't recall. The photographs may show, but I don't recall.
Yeah. So, whatever the photographs, they speak for themselves with regards to that.
Yes.
You have no additional knowledge with regards to the door itself.
That's correct.
When you got to the scene, was the door already open?
I don't recall.
You don't recall ever opening it or closing it one way yourself, though?
I do not recall.
Was the front door itself ever processed for the potential presence of latent fingerprints?
Not by me.
Isn't a doorknob or an entryway into a residence, especially when there's no forced entry, a place that a crime scene would generally be processed for the presence of latent fingerprints?
Yes.
But in this instance, that didn't occur.
Not by me.
And was that a specific decision made by you that you recall?
I don't recall why I did not process the door. It's possible that someone else had already processed it before I arrived.
But you don't have any knowledge of that?
I don't recall if that person processed that door.
And do you recall Detective Pettis or Detective Morgan telling you not to process the door for some reason?
No.
You described in terms of the testimony that one clothing item, a white tank top that was found at the scene, was seized by you, placed into evidence, and you made the presumption based upon your observance of that item here today that it had gone to FDLE. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that presumption was made based upon the fact that your original markings were on the envelope, and also there appeared to be evidence tape or additional markings that you were presuming was from FDLE.
Correct.
Why did you presume it was from FDLE?
They have their a distinctive label that they put on their items, plus they also have red evidence tape that's marked with FDLE, that's similar way that ours is marked with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office.
So as a result of that, you just made a reasonable presumption it had been sent and presumably tested in some way by FDLE.
Yes.
You also referred to the fact that there was a baby's onesie that you had seized as an item of evidence at the scene. Is that correct?
Yes.
I believe looking at your notes, that would be item number 11 that you described as being a onesie that was possibly blood-stained by marker H. Is that correct?
Yes.
Have you had the opportunity to examine that item to see whether or not there was indications on that item that it had been sent to FDLE for testing?
I have not.
So you have no idea one way or the other whether that item was ever tested?
That's correct.
And therefore the results of any testing that may have occurred to that item?
Right.
Is that fair?
Yes.
In addition to the items that we've generally referred to, I understand from your report that you also seized some other items at the scene. Actually, a total of 13 items were collected at the scene, correct?
No, actually there were 20 items, and then 2 from apartment G.
Okay. 20 items being in 2 different inventory control numbers, 1 through 13 in one control number and 14 through 20 in the other. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The items that were contained in the total of 20 collected items of evidence, do you know how many of those specific 20 items that were collected were ever processed for the presence of either latent fingerprint evidence or DNA evidence?
As far as latent fingerprint evidence, no, I don't know that, and I believe that the pacifiers were sent off for DNA analysis, but I don't know the results of that.
Did you conduct, on the 20 items of physical evidence that were seized from the scene, did you conduct any specific additional testing on those items once they had been collected from the scene?
No.
And I presume you have your report in front of you?
Yes.
If I can just go through those item by item with you. Item number 1 indicates a swab of possible stained blood at marker A, and that's already been referred to here today, correct?
Yes.
And then a pacifier at marker B, and that's been referred to here today, correct?
Yes.
And then a baby carrier at marker C. Did you process that baby carrier in any way?
No.
On the surface of the baby carrier, that was presumably a partially plastic and partially metal item, potentially also cloth?
Yes.
Did you process it yourself in any ways for either the presence of DNA evidence or for latent fingerprint evidence?
No.
Is there anything about the general surface of a baby carrier that would suggest to you that it would not be able to be processed for either DNA evidence or latent fingerprint evidence?
Again, without looking at the plastic surface, it's hard to determine whether or not it would be a good candidate for latent development.
And then item number 4 was a pacifier found under the carrier, and you conducted no testing on that, correct?
Right.
And a swab of possible blood stain evidence at marker D, a location that's indicated on your crime scene diagram. You didn't test any of that?
No.
There's also swabs of hole evidence at marker E and marker F. And we've seen photographs of those holes at the scene. Is there anything about those holes that would have indicated to you that they were fresh damage or recent damage?
It's not able to be determined.
Well, one of the things I think we could potentially look for is if there was damage to a plaster or a drywall wall, is we can look to see whether there was indication of fresh plaster or fresh drywall on the ground. Is that something reasonable to look for at a crime scene?
Yes.
Do you recall in this particular instance looking to see whether there was indication of fresh damage to the wall in the form of either drywall or plaster dust that was found near where the damage to the walls were found?
I don't recall.
So if it was there or if it wasn't there, you just don't know. Do you recall photographing with close-ups the areas beneath where the holes were found at the scene?
Beneath them, like to the
On the ground, on the floor?
Oh, no, I didn't.
So whether there was or there wasn't evidence, you don't know.
That's correct.
And you have no idea how long the holes had been there.
That's correct.
So they could have been there for days, weeks, months, or years.
I don't know.
Then you talked about the comfort already. Then there was a swab of a stain at marker H, and you didn't conduct any additional examination on that?
I did not.
And the blue blanket you referred to, possibly stained, you referred to, and the onesie you referred to, both of which were collected as evidence, but you conducted no additional analysis on them. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The dark blue blanket by marker H, was that analyzed in any way by you at the scene or just collected and packaged?
Just collected.
So whether there was or wasn't any blood on that item is unknown to you.
That's correct.
The item marked as item number 13, a black T-shirt under a blanket by marker H. Why, do you recall, was that particular item collected, if you know?
Because it was underneath the blanket, and it was like a part of the kind of grouping of those items.
And so the reason that was selected out of all the clothing items that were at the scene was its proximity to the blanket.
Correct.
And it was in direct proximity to the blanket?
Yes.
And based upon your training, knowledge, and experience, was it in sufficient proximity that if there was DNA evidence on one of those items or the other, that it was in enough contact with each other that possibly DNA evidence could have been transferred from one item to the other item?
That's impossible for me to answer. I don't know if the proximity of it would have been enough. That's just simply something that's outside the scope of my expertise.
That's fine. And then you talked about the white tank top that was found under the hassock, and then the laundry basket itself was collected?
Yes.
And is that a plastic laundry basket?
Yes.
And the surface of that plastic laundry basket, would that be the normal plastic basket that we would find if we went to the department store to buy for our laundry?
Correct.
Is that a surface that appeared to be a surface that could have been processed for the presence of latent fingerprints?
Possibly.
Did you process it?
I did not.
Do you know if anyone else did?
I don't know that.
The Gatorade bottle we've already talked about. We've already talked about the men's clothing item that were collected because you were directed to do it by either Detective Pettis or Detective Morgan, but you never conducted any later processing on that. Is that correct?
No, I did not.
Then there's a cable bill for the residence that was in the name of Richard Anthony Mctear, Jr. Is that right?
It was in the name of Richard Mctear.
I'm sorry. That Richard Mctear cable bill that was there, it was just a printed bill like would normally be sent to somebody's house?
Yes.
The surface of paper, is that a surface from which latent fingerprints can potentially be obtained?
Yes.
And how does that occur on paper? What kind of process would be done?
When your hands make contact with paper, your fingerprints actually get on paper. It's absorbed into the paper. We then use, there's a variety of different chemical processes you can do that react to the different possible substances that are in the fingerprint that would return a chemical reaction, so it might turn it like a dark brown or purple, depending on the different chemical that you're using.
And do you recall, as you sit here today, that cable bill in the name of Richard Mctear, was it for the residence that you were processing?
Yes.
That same apartment?
Yes.
It was a bill for the cable service to that apartment that was in the name of Richard Mctear?
I don't know that it was for service at that apartment. I could tell you is that it had that Richard Mctear was the name on it, and it was to that address. As far as the service address, I don't know without looking at the bill.
Okay. But you do at least recall that it was sent to Richard Mctear at that address?
Yes.
And also you found another paper item, I understand, at the scene, a birth certificate for a child of Mr. Mctear.
Yes.
And how did you know that it was a child of Mr. Mctear?
He was listed as the father.
Okay, and on that it was on a paper birth certificate?
Yes.
Not laminated in any way, just a copy of a birth certificate?
I don't believe it was laminated, no.
And did you process that paper for the potential presence of any latent fingerprints?
No.
I referred briefly to you, I believe, with regards to a carpet sample that was literally cut out of the floor and taken as potential evidence.
Yes.
And is it your testimony here also that you didn't participate in actually processing that carpet swab or that carpet section in any way?
No, I did not.
Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, you don't know.
I don't have that information.
I heard your testimony with regards to photographs that were taken at apartment G. Is that correct?
Yes.
Which was not the primary apartment, but an apartment where you understood that had some involvement with this case.
Yes.
Tell me what your understanding was of what the involvement of apartment G was with the case.
My understanding was that a neighbor had come out and offered some comfort to the mother of the victim and had brought out a cold cloth, a wet cloth, like as a compress to wipe her face and to help soothe her.
And when you say the mother of the victim, is that someone that was identified to you as Jasmine Bedwell?
Yes.
And tell me why it was significant to you that she had been offered a compress to wipe her face.
I don't know that there was any significance.
Okay. Why is it, if you know, that you were requested to process the presence of the cloths at apartment G?
Because I was asked to.
That's it. Somebody said, would you please do this? And you said, yes, sir.
Yes.
And so you went and took photographs of the items?
Yes.
And did you also collect the items?
Yes, I did.
And place them into evidence?
Yes.
So why it was significant to look at those two cloth items that were found in some other apartment, you just don't know the answer to.
That's correct.
Is a cloth item like the towels that you collected, that you described as a white washcloth from the windowsill and the blue and white dishcloth from the sink, are those items from which, based upon your training, knowledge, and experience, you believe that it's possible to have obtained DNA evidence?
It's possible.
And is that especially true when somebody is wiping their face with a cloth, that you might have a greater expectation of finding DNA evidence on it?
That would be possible, yes.
Rather than simply picking it up with a dry, non-sweaty hand, it would be a different thing to be wiping your face or wiping your tears with it.
Correct.
Because sweat and tears both are items from which DNA evidence could be found.
Correct.
And so, whose DNA evidence was on those two items, the white and blue towel and the white washcloth, you just don't know?
I don't have that information.
In the course of processing the crime scene, did Detective Pettis or Detective Morgan, or anybody else for that matter, or any other people involved in the investigation, ever talk to you about potential evidence at the scene belonging to a young man identified as Ladarius Moore?
No.
Is that a name you've ever heard about in the course of processing this crime scene?
No.
Did you ever look for any paperwork at the scene that might have had his name on it?
I don't recall there being any paperwork with a different name on it. No.
Did you hear about any possible clothing items related to him that were potentially at the scene?
No.
Were Detective Pettis and Detective Morgan with you the entire time you were processing the scene?
Yes, to the best of my recollection.
Do you know who ultimately secured the crime scene after you completed?
No.
We'll talk to you a little bit more about questions I asked as items were being received in evidence, and that's the issue of contamination at the scene. Contamination is something that as a crime scene technician you're very aware of.
Yes.
And there are procedures that exist to make sure that cross-contamination isn't occurring. Is that right?
That's correct.
Because the truth is, if you touch something, it's possible that you put your DNA evidence on that item.
That's correct.
And also, if you've touched an item and then touch a second item or a third item, it would be possible, at least, for you to contaminate that other item by what you transferred to the other item. Is that possible?
Yes.
And that's why you're going through the process of changing gloves at the scene. Otherwise, you might put on one glove to be safe, and you could go through the whole process of processing the scene But the reason you change your gloves is because once you touch something that has DNA on it, and then you touch something else, it's a possibility that the DNA that was on one item suddenly is being passed over to another item.
That's correct.
And you testified, if I understood you correctly, that there are procedures in place to make sure that that isn't occurring.
Correct.
And it's your general recollection that you followed the procedures and guidelines that exist at the sheriff's office in the course of handling evidence in this case.
Yes.
But I heard you say that it was 4 years ago, and with regards to any individual item that's at the scene, you don't have specific recollection as to whether you followed those procedures with any particular item at the scene. Is that correct?
That's correct, but I also don't know if I locked my house this morning. I'm assuming I did, because I normally do. So it's the same kind of thing with the gloves. I assume I did it.
I got it. It's the same kind of thing. What's different about it is that we're talking about processing items at a murder scene, and as you sit here this morning, you don't recall whether you changed your gloves at that murder scene.
No.
I have no additional questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
Redirect. Ms. DeWitt, when you finish processing a crime scene, do you write a report related to that processing?
Yes, I did.
And does your report indicate the steps you took during that processing?
In general, yes.
2008 to May 5th of 2009.
Yes.
So if DNA was found at some scene, it could have been put there 6 months ago.
Correct.
In terms of the transferring or moving around of DNA evidence, do you think it's fair to presume that babies, due to their nature of spitting and wetting their diapers and drooling and having their faces wiped, that they're more likely to spread DNA evidence than adults are?
Not having any children, I cannot accurately answer that.
So you don't know?
I do not know.
But all of those things that I mentioned, urine or feces or drool or runny noses, all would potentially contain DNA evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And based upon training, knowledge, and experience, if a baby's face was wiped with a diaper or a cloth or a T-shirt or any other item, it would be possible to transfer DNA evidence material from one to the other.
That's correct.
And is it your experience and knowledge and training that DNA evidence can potentially be found on different types of surfaces and objects?
Yes.
Also, your understanding that DNA evidence, in terms of being found, you can find it in a couple of different ways. You can swab it, as you talked about.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Where you take a potential surface and you rub, as you say, a swab on it, and hoping to pick up material, and that's by using a wet swab generally, right?
Yes.
And then you're hoping that what's been transferred to that surface is then transferred to that swab, and then when that swab is given to an analyst for the purposes of attempting to evaluate it, that what was on that surface that was swabbed or rubbed would then be on the swab itself for the purpose of analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And so that's one of the ways that you collect DNA evidence from the scene.
Yes.
The other way is you can collect the object itself, clothing items as an example. Is that right?
That's right.
If it's suspected that blood is on an item, or spit, or drool, or anything else that contained a body fluid is on a clothing item, one means would be to collect that actual clothing item, and then the clothing item itself can be tested chemically or electronically to determine the presence of DNA. Existing on a surface, that DNA evidence is transferred through body fluids, is that correct?
That could be one way, yes.
It's also possible that it's transferred through essentially skin cells.
Correct.
Any part of my body that touches or comes in contact with another surface, and that can be another body, can't it?
Correct.
If parts of my body fluids, my skin, my hair, some portion of me that contains genetic information with regards to me comes in contact with some other surface or some other body, my DNA evidence can be transferred.
Can be, yes.
It doesn't happen every time.
That's correct.
And the process of you going through and trying to identify certain evidence at the scene to determine whether or not DNA evidence is present, you realize that it could be on a surface for an extended period of time.
Correct.
So no reason that you would have to believe, is there, that if DNA evidence was found on a particular item, that you would be able to identify when it was placed on that item?
That's correct.
That's true, that it can extend over time periods.
Correct.
And certainly that time period would include from December of 2000.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
This particular instance, you took a section of carpeting out of the house that had potential blood staining on it. Is that correct?
That's right.
And the reason you took that out of the house was because you were going to test the actual item itself, the carpeting itself, or the marks on the carpeting, to see if it contained DNA evidence.
That's correct.
One of the other things that you're testing is for the presence of blood. And you're looking at an item that looks like it's potentially blood, and that's because it's red or brownish in color. Is that essentially how you're deciding what's potentially blood at a scene?
That's one of the ways, yes.
It's a common sense element. It's the primary way that you look at something and say, this might be blood, because it looks like blood.
Correct.
There's a chemical test that can be done on that blood at the scene, or on that potential blood at the scene, and that's generally done by swabbing also.
Correct.
And in this instance, you took several samples of what was potentially blood evidence at the scene. Is that correct?
That's right.
But whether it is or whether it isn't blood is something that you can't tell in any way by looking at it, can you?
No.
In this particular instance, did you analyze the latent fingerprint, whether that fingerprint was left there on that surface in December of 2008, or whether it was left there on May 5th of 2009, you wouldn't be able to determine that?
Unless there were some other factors that influenced the fingerprint, no.
I meant just on the latent print alone.
No.
And based upon your training experience, you don't have any reason to believe that it's likely that anyone else would be able to make that determination.
That's correct.
With regards to DNA evidence, is it your understanding, based upon your training and knowledge and experience, that DNA evidence can continue to exist on a surface for an extended period of time? Or is there a limited period of time when DNA evidence exists?
No, it would be the same thing again based on, other factors that would affect the evidence itself.
And that's things like temperature and
Weather,
heat and
exactly.
moisture and weather and all of those kinds of things.
That's correct.
But isn't it possible, based upon your training and knowledge and experience, that DNA evidence can exist for a long period of time,
Yes.
certainly longer than 6 months?
Yes.
And when we're talking about DNA evidence,